Good morning, fourth grade. Today we're going to be reviewing a bit more about food webs and the ecosystems. Let's get started. So, as we've been learning in a food web, there are many different roles that organisms play. There are producers, who are those organisms who are able to make or produce their food. For example, things like trees, flowers, plants, or vegetables are all producers because they can make their own food. In a food web, there are also consumers. Consumers are those organisms that they need to consume or eat other organisms for energy. Consumers cannot make their own food. They have to eat another organism for energy. So, for example, organisms like rabbits, lions, sharks, squirrels, those are all examples of consumers because these organisms need to eat something else in order to have energy. And some consumers have a different preference or taste on what they like to eat, but we'll learn about the different types of consumers in a bit. In a food web, there are also decomposers. Decomposers are those organisms that kind of clean up and break down everything. Decomposers are the organisms that eat dead plants and animals. They help the dead plants and animals be broken down into smaller pieces so that they won't pile up on the earth. The three roles in a food web are producers, who make their own food, consumers who eat others for energy, and decomposers who break down dead plants and animals. Let's take a look at this food web. Can you tell me which of these organisms is the producer? Thank you for sharing your thinking. If you said green grass is a producer, that is right. Green grass is an example of a producer. Now let's find some consumers. Share with me on Edpuzzle. What are some consumers? Name at least 2 consumers on this food web. Thank you for sharing your thinking. If you said snail, frog, owl, snake, and grasshopper, that is correct. All 5 of these organisms are examples of consumers. Because when we take a close look, notice how each of these consumers have an arrow pointing to them? That is because they need to be able to eat some type of food for their energy, and they are called consumers. There's another role which we do not see on this specific food web, and that is decomposers. Some examples of decomposers are bacteria and fungi. However, they are not seen on this food web. We have identified our producers and our consumers. Earlier, I said there are different types of consumers. For example, consumers who only eat plants, like the snail and grasshopper. Those are known as herbivores. These 2 organisms are herbivore consumers because their diet mainly consists of grass. Now the frog, the snake, and the owl, who eats either a snail, grasshopper, or the owl who eats the frog and the snake, they are examples of carnivores. Let's read a bit more about the different types of consumers. So there are 3 types of consumers. The first one that we talked about was an herbivore, like the snail and the grasshopper who eat grass. There is also carnivores. Carnivores like the owl, frog, or snake are examples of carnivores because these are consumers who are eating other animals for meat. That's how they get their energy. Carnivores have to eat other animals for meat to give them energy. Our third type of consumer is the omnivore. Omnivore are those consumers who will eat both plants and both animals. Let's take a look at this food web that was on our test. On this food web, we have our producers, skunk cabbage, grasses, and sedges. All these plants are producers. And then all these organisms up top are examples of consumers. Let's find some consumers. Can you tell me which of these consumers is an herbivore? Is it the deer mouse? Or is it the grizzly bear? If you said deer mouse, that is correct. The deer mouse is an example of an herbivore because we see the two arrows that point to it are grasses and sedges and red elderberry. The grizzly bear is not an herbivore because it eats plants, but it also eats salmon. Let's take a look at the red squirrel. The red squirrel is also an example of an herbivore. The red squirrel eats from the Sitka spruce tree. That is an example of an herbivore. However, the food web does not end at the red squirrel. The red squirrel is then eaten by a marten, who is a carnivore. The marten is a carnivore because it eats salmon, red squirrel, and deer mouse, meaning that it eats other different animals for energy. To determine what type of consumer an organism is, you just have to take a close look, follow the arrows to see what it is eating, and then you'll be able to tell. If it's eating just plants, like the porcupine, who eat the skunk cabbage, it is a herbivore. If it's eating just meat, like the marten who eats salmon, red squirrel, and deer mouse, it is a carnivore. But if it's eating both plants and meat, like the grizzly bear who eats skunk cabbage, stinging needle, salmon, grasses and hedges, and red elderberry, it is an omnivore because it eats both plants and meat. That is all for our lesson today. We are going to be wrapping up food webs. Next week, we are going to be doing some at-home experiments. I will post a list of supplies that you will need on Google Classroom and also share it out with your parents. It is not necessary that you get these supplies, but if you are able to, you will be able to complete some experiments at home. Make sure to get mom and dad's permission first. Have an awesome Thursday. See you Monday.